Battlefield games share a similar pattern to Windows releases. Every second release is a bit crap, or at the very least not as impactful as before. Is 2042 a Windows XP or an ME? Let's blow some shit up. There's no denying the dramatic, flamboyant and above all dynamic nature of the Battlefield series. They have been and remain very fun games, some more than others. We all know the game by now though. Huge maps, vehicles aplenty, dynamic events and destruction, snipers everywhere and some Maverick or Blue Thunder wannabe doing your head in. The formula remains pretty static, except it has slowly been stripped of features over time. This year we get no attempt at single player, less maps to start with and pretty much 2 main modes plus Portal, which is an eclectic mix of old maps from the Battlefield legacy but open for you to make a game type within. As good as it is though, the make your own game modes option is the gaming equivalent of self-service tills. You're paying the same price to serve yourself. Content or lack thereof aside, the typical RAM-packed options, tweaking and customizations are present, which does help, specifically the sound choices in the menu and visual ones even on console. Turning off motion blur, film grain, chromatic aberration, adjusting for the HUD, and all these things really add up to that bespoke nature and something I always do. Aside the FOV here, because that means the tests are all static and identical. So today we're going to cover the 3 now generation machines and PC, which I did cover during a pre-launch DICE event over on IGN last month, which has more PC focused info, so go and check that out after this one. First things first though, what tech and tools are we looking at here? Well, Frostbite 3 returns, but many key technology leads do not. Long since absent from DICE, such as rendering lead Johan Anderson among others, left a few years ago to set up their company Embark Studios. The lack of direction does present in this title with very little improvement, certainly from a technical perspective over previous releases. Some may say regression, as ray trace reflections are out and ray trace ambient occlusion is now present, again only on PC with the RDNA 2 or RTX cards. Again, I covered in more depth on the IGN video. It is better than the game's poor, in my opinion, HBAO solution, but at least since that pre-launch event they have added in HBAO Plus now, which they now call HBAO Ultra. But in the midst of battle, the cost versus return is arguably worse than Reflections. Frostbite landed in 2008's Bad Company, and the engine has since evolved from then into its 3rd iteration, which has remained since 2013's Battlefield 4 release. From then it has become the single technology solution throughout EA's release roster, almost. A very capable engine and in many ways ahead of its peers at the start of last generation, but time and tide waits for no man, and in 2021 it no longer feels cutting edge, but more on that later. One big feature of the engine is checkerboard rendering, and like many previous releases such as Battlefield 1, Mass Effect et al., it is in use again here on consoles. It also, as a byproduct or economies of scale, employs a TAA solution to help stabilize pixel shimmer from temporal instability between frames, more specifically on high frequency areas such as light specular or thin distant objects. The checkerboard solution is a robust one, and you can still see signs of it here, even with motion blur turned off, where it can look a little like checkerboard itself due to that dithered construction. But with that width reconstruction giving signs of the jittered camera across 2 frames, this looks to be potentially based on a 1920 by 2160 base, but counts do fluctuate, and that is obviously compounded by the fact that it uses a dynamic scaler here even on PC. But how does it run on consoles then? Well, compared to PC's Ultra, we're not seeing a huge gap. From my quick comparison, some settings such as textures, post effects and lighting all look or at an indistinguishable level from Ultra. Subtle reductions to high on shadows, LOD, foliage, and possibly a medium on distant objects or dynamic objects, but these can be very hard to spot. Even in static shots on PC, only RTAO shows up any noticeable improvement, but once you're moving, you probably never notice it anyway. The impact on PC can be high and not worth the cost, both in CPU, RAM and GPU, so really I'd just turn it off. PlayStation 5 and Series X are identical on settings, with both targeting a 3840 by 2160 image via that checkerboard solution. Again, both are dynamic, but on counts here we can see somewhere between 8% and 23% at its worst delta to the Series X over the PlayStation 5, such as this shot here, which is the absolute worst I could find. In terms of the Series X here, it's 4K, but on PS5 it's 3456 by 1944, which a moment before this shot, that's the same as the Series X. So the game does scale quite heavily, but obviously when you're up at these 4K resolutions, such a small percentile can be hard to notice. Something not true of the Series S, with this exact same shot coming in at a high point for the Series S of 2304 by 1296, which is almost 70% reduction on the resolution from the Series X and almost the same on the PS5. This also means that the game scales quite heavily and can drop as low as 1792 by 972. Again though, the game is predominantly at or around 1080p, that should have been the choice they made to help performance. Then again though, maybe not, as some frame time misses are not just GPU related, but I'll get to that in a moment. In terms of settings, the Series S actually does a pretty decent job of looking very, very close to the other two. Even in these shots you'd probably struggle to notice, but there's a reduction in LOD on foliage, grass alphas are reduced, HBAO within the frustum, and billboards are used much closer. But by far the biggest gap is resolution, which even without zooming in looks softer, noisier and less refined. This really stands out in SSR reflections, which are not well implemented even on the other consoles or PC at Ultra. On the Series S they are very low quality, quarter resolution with obvious blocky and columnized structure to them, possibly also used in checkerboarding. These present heavy banding silhouettes around objects, tiny leaves blowing past streak over them, as they are also included in the TAA pass, making them ghost and smear, as do transparencies in glass. The top levels on PS5, Series X and PC do look significantly better, but they still suffer from the same problems. It's just less egregious levels. SSR has never been great in these titles. Battlefield 5 used it as a fallback to the RT reflections, and Hardline also used it over the straight cube maps, and again they were very noisy and at times more distracting than benefiting. Something that can also happen here on large pools, they look noisy and still draw out when occluded or off screen. Now, although the straight projected cube maps can look obvious and we are left with those on last generation machines, it can really create a disconnected scene, often with glass light puddles creating another Portal look as light and shadow reflection just cast straight through objects unrealistically. And again, it all looks like a hole to another dimension rather than a true water surface reflection. But I guess it's still better to have SSR over these. That said, the last generations, presented here in the worst it has to offer in the Xbox One S, still offer a true version of the core game, just at much lower resolutions, sometimes 720p here, medium or lower than low settings, 64 players rather than 128 in Conquest, tearing pretty much all the time, and often just basically 30 FPS like performance. But it shows this is still a last gen title at heart. You can check out more on that when I compared it in my Battlefield 4 versus Battlefield 2042 video, which will be up very soon for patrons and everybody else later on YouTube. Back to PC and now gen consoles, they obviously benefit significantly in terms of IQ, quality and performance, don't they? Well, taking the PC spec first, I've got two here. This is the RTX 2070, again heavily overclocked to closer to a 2070 Super with 3.8 GHz Zen 2700X, 16 GB of RAM. It really is a pretty decent machine, around 9.3 teraflops of performance. As you can see here, using very similar settings, probably slightly lower than what the consoles are running, it struggles to hold anywhere close to 60. And this is with dynamic scaling on, which means it's generally also at a much lower resolution than both the Series X and the PlayStation 5 at these settings, but that's expected. It's not as powerful a machine. It does lose out quite significantly, but not all of these issues, as you can see from performance here, are related to GPU. Again, just like I covered with my Zen 3600 on the IGN video, it can generally swamp one single core of a CPU. Here, 100% running all the time, even on the menu, and generally the game is stalling left, right and center across every aspect. It's likely going to be memory bound, CPU bound, GPU bound and everything else bound at some point. It really does feel and look and play like like an alpha, an early alpha at that. There are a lot of issues and bugs in this title, and I did start looking at the comparison between the settings, but again, just like before, there's no point, because generally performance is inconsistent across the board, and as you can see, the RTX 2070 here is generally somewhere between 65 and 100% utilization, and it fluctuates heavily at any point in the title. Again, these are not just dependent on the hardware. Do not use this game as an example of how the hardware is running the title at all. It really does not run well. One of its biggest problems is the fact that it can utilize almost the entire 16 gigabytes of system RAM on my machine here, and that means it's then forcing that to use slower RAM, writing it through the PCI Express back to the GPU, and that means it can exceed, get close to 10 gigabytes of RAM. And I think that may be one of the reasons why we're seeing a specific issue on the Series X. Like I say, in addition to the fact that the code is all over the place. And this is true even of my much more powerful RX 6800 machine, again powered with a Zen 3600, and this still does hold, obviously much closer to 4K and obviously much closer to 60 FPS, but generally it can still stutter and judder quite heavily at certain points. And a lot of these issues come down to the fact that the game just needs a lot more work to be ready. This doesn't mean that it's bad across the board. I would say it's arguably worse on PC, but that's largely down to the thing that the consoles actually force slightly higher levels of quality control before they can be released on the store, and therefore some of the bugs we see on PC, such as people floating in the air, not being able to shoot, losing control of your character and you can't shoot anymore, or actually change from a knife back to a gun. I didn't get any of these issues on all three consoles that I tested, including the last generation as well, over and above what I'm covering here. So that means that moving over to the Series S, we really are looking at a title that isn't heavily optimized to run on any machine, but one of the worst maps across every single piece of hardware is Manifest. It's probably one of the better maps in terms of playstyles and the way you can snipe in and out, go up high, go up low. There's lots of avenues throughout it. But again, I think a lot of this is down to the fact that they're just not culling very much, or at least they do have a lot of optimization here on this particular level because it struggles on every piece of hardware. On the Series S, it can be, sub 40 into the 30s, just like it can, as you just saw a minute ago, on my RTX 2070. And that means most of the time it feels inconsistent. It doesn't tear, at least, which is a benefit over the last generation titles, but it feels horrible, juddery and stuttery. Other maps are better and do get closer to that 60 FPS, but generally the Series S is somewhere anywhere between 45 and 60 FPS on every single map. And once you're into action, it generally doesn't feel as consistent and smooth as other previous Battlefield titles have felt.
One of our objectives has been lost. The enemy has Bravo sector. Our troops are... We have captured all of Delta sector. They now control Charlie sector. Occupied sector Delta.
So the bigger brother in the Series X is much better. It can actually hold a consistent 60 FPS in many areas. The Series S just does not do it. But that doesn't mean it's a locked 60. Again, there's no tearing, but just driving around even in peaceful areas on Orbital here, it can still drop a frame here and there. But once you get into action, it can stutter and judder a little bit more than I would like. It's not terrible, but once you're getting blown up, as you can see here, it can drop a few frames. Again, these are hard to spot. But what what can happen in heavy action is it can cause the game to start juddering and stuttering quite heavily, and worse still, the Series X specifically has one problem, as I mentioned on the PC, which I don't think happens on any other console. At least I tested it thoroughly, multiple hours on the PS5, multiple hours on the Series S, and it didn't happen once, but it happened multiple times on the Series X. Now, Manifest is probably the worst map for it to happen, but also Discarded, the one here, can also cause these issues as well. And it's really bad at some points. All the sound stops, the entire game sync happens. Again, I think it might be related to just bleeding over that 10 gigabytes of RAM, but overall, the real problem is the fact that the game is not quite ready for launch, or there's significant issues in the code base itself that it's causing all these performance dips. And that means you can see here, it just stops and drops down to 0 FPS. And it got me killed a few times. It's quite frustrating because it can happen, and it feels like a lifetime when you're playing the title, but obviously it's not really. It's around a second, maybe slightly more at certain points. But the problem is that when you're stuck in that one place, you can't move. Anyone else playing the game isn't locked in, therefore they can drive right up to you or just shoot you, so you come back and you're dead. There's multiple issues in the console versions as well. I've fallen through floors, you join games that have ended, you get no server browsers, you got the rubber banding issue, which again, it's not as bad as it was in Battlefield 4, but it's certainly there. And again, that can cause physics to reset, and you start getting, you know, your vehicles jostling up and down. And overall, there's just too many issues across every single version that really makes me think it should have launched early next year. But obviously, EA being EA and finance being finance, that was never going to happen. Again, you can have these, you know, sub 50 FPS long points on the Series X in Manifest, which is one of the worst maps of the lot. It's heavily unoptimized, and as I've just covered on PC, it's got nothing directly to do with the hardware or even the GPU itself. It's just the issues inherent to the version, or the state of the version the code is at this point.
Need a second! Grenade out! Counting down!
We now hold Sector Alpha. Objective captured. We have secured most of the sectors. Defend them at all costs. Most sectors are now under our control. Now attacking Delta 1.
So finally we get to the PlayStation 5, and it's a similar story to the Series X. Overall, it's slightly better in driving around and traversing the land and shooting in quieter areas, but not by much. But it doesn't have that heavy stutter that we saw on the Series X, like I say, but it does have some heavier dips, again on the same maps. Manifest, again, is a very bad map for the PS5, just like it is for the Xbox Series X and the Series S. It tends to drop frames when it really shouldn't. Other maps, such as Orbital, Breakaway or Hourglass, do tend to run much better and hold 60 FPS more often than not. But again, if you're getting into heavy action, lots of people around you, it can drop a frame here or there, which you can definitely notice as you're playing the title, because you can feel it on the controller. But once you get into Manifest, it can drop down to 40 FPS levels for too long. And there, it feels bad. In fact, Manifest is a good map, but it feels so bad to play that I don't like playing it, and I go back to other maps. So I like Orbital because it performs pretty well, especially when you're up high and sniping. It can feel quite consistent. Flying vehicles or driving vehicles, all of those areas can still feel a little juddery at times, driving tanks. But again, at least it doesn't have the heavy dips, but it can have longer dips on certain maps. And again, it's not about the hardware, so don't take this comparison and this analysis as any kind of detriment and any piece of hardware you may or may not support. This really is a title that highlights just how much effort goes into making big games like this to run on multiple pieces of hardware and to optimize them to run well on each of them. The Series X probably has the most egregious problem in terms of online titles. It judders and drops frames for long periods of time that you're just stuck in one spot. That's bad. But there are points on the PS5 where it can drop down to 40 FPS, and that really is unacceptable when you've got dynamic scaling in place. But like I say, many of these issues that I'm discussing and showing you here are almost certainly nothing to do with the GPU, and they are certainly not anything to represent the hardware itself.
Assaulting Alpha 2.
The game obviously has a collection of other issues. Low poly counts drawing in, texture streaming, certainly on older generation consoles, definitely. Falling through floors when you're trying to shoot people. Rubber banding is present just like it was in Battlefield 4. It's not quite as bad, but it certainly appears you get dragged back a few feet and then physics start to reset in the title when they're doing it. It happens on every single version. And just a collection of other issues that really shouldn't be accepted from a title like this. I mean, the fact that you can't browse servers and pick the match you want, you have to keep resetting the same search. There's so many things that just feel like it shouldn't be at this stage, and they haven't learnt lessons from the exact same issues they had with Battlefield 4. But the biggest problem with the title overall, outside of all these technical issues, is it just isn't that good. Going back to the very start of this video, this is an ME of Battlefield titles. Battlefield 4 has better maps, better construction, better game styles, and only with 64 players. This has 128 players, and that does help in some of the maps, and it feels quite barren when you play it on last generation consoles with only 64 players, but it doesn't feel as if it's really stepping forward. It feels like it's more of the same. In fact, I'd say this feels like DLC to Battlefield 4. I hope the team work hard to improve it, but right now I cannot recommend this no matter what the format. At least the PS5 and the Series X do get close to an almost shining version of the title overall. You need very powerful PC hardware to play this, and if you're using this to represent any kind of hardware battle you may have, then pick another game. This isn't representative of anything at all, other than the team either lack experience or overall they lacked time to deliver it. Anyway, if you like these deep dives into game technology, multiple formats and everything else, remember I'm completely self-funded and independent, and all of this does take a lot of time outside of my full-time job. This is a part-time gig, so you can help by subscribing down below, sharing where appropriate, commenting, because that really helps. Give it a thumbs up and a thumbs down. I'm not a big fan of the dislike being removed from YouTube, but obviously if you didn't like it, then hit the dislike, but tell me down below what you didn't like about the video. And if you can, any pounds or dollars you can spare on Patreon really do help me immensely. Anyway, I'm out, but I'll see you very soon, in fact tomorrow, with another video. I'll catch you on the next one.